Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. So we're continuing with the Facebook online series, Palestine De-Colonial series, which is to look at Palestine's history, context from a decolonial lens, in the hope of understanding the development that took place from the early part of the 20th century onward, as well as going a little bit before the 20th century to understand and contextualize what have occurred in Palestine. This is to be placed, this is the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, which set in motion the colonization of Palestine and setting in motion the colonial legacy that we continue to experience from the British Balfour to the mandate of the League of Nations, giving the British the right and the authority to govern over Palestine and then facilitate the incubation of the Zionist programs for and plans for creating a national homeland in Palestine, culminating with the 1948 Nakba, which we're moving into the 70th year anniversary in 2018. And the Nakba is an ongoing process that Palestinians are experiencing. Also yesterday was November 29th. It's also recognized as the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinians, an important part of expressions of solidarity and how these expressions of solidarity relative to Palestine have been articulated in the long history of Palestinian resistance to their continued dispossession. And at a later point in this series, Palestine Decolonial series, I will actually also examine the concept of solidarity. What does it mean to be in solidarity with a people that are living under a settler colonial structure, dispossession, and how this is to be articulated, considering that many individuals who are entering into the Palestine space might enter it from a different conceptualization, and it's important for us to discuss and highlight the principles and the understanding of solidarity. So today what I wanted to focus on for a few minutes is Zionist immigration and settlement in Palestine. But at the beginning is to delineate between religious Zionism or immigration to Palestine from a purely religious outlook. And I understand and can really comprehend the urge and the need for individuals who are pursuing a religious expression to seek that religious expression by migrating to a place that they hold sacred to themselves. And as such, throughout the history of both the Arab world and the Muslim world, that the migration and the arrival to locations of religious affinity, be it for the Jewish populations or the Christian population, is something that we see has been part and parcel of that legacy. So the issue that I am arriving at is not an issue of religious arrival and immigration and visitation to Palestine, but specifically to speak about Zionist immigration as a way to facilitate the settler colonial project that is intended to displace, expel, transfer, and engage in acts that would qualify under the international law as acts of genocide toward the Palestinians. And I don't use the term genocide very lightly. And again, if we look at the definition of the Convention on Genocide, we could say that what happened to the Palestinians and what continued to happen can be qualified under such acts. And others also have argued in terms of the continuation of the committing of war crimes toward the Palestinians. So my focus is in here is not on religious Zionism or migration of Jewish migration specifically to Palestine for religious purposes. I think that's something that we set aside. The issue in here specifically is the project that begins and is articulated in essence with Herzl's plan to create a state, a Jordan state that's specifically coming from a Zionist perspective, secular in nature in its foundation, that from its inception sought to displace the indigenous Palestinian population and to commit them to transfer outside of the historical borders of Palestine. Now, from the Zionist immigration pattern, often the concept that is used and introduced in relations to immigration to Palestine is the concept of aliyah, which literally also have a comparable term to it, which is ali or al-ula, or to essentially to ascend or to go up. So in essence, Zionist immigration have framed the arrival to Palestine as an act of ascending, which is to go high, and specifically to go high toward Palestine, but also to ascend toward Jerusalem as the site of sacredness. And as such, it was, even though that Zionism is a secular movement, a secular political movement, it couched its framing relative to immigration in religious terminology, and in essence to make it appealing and understandable relative to the Jewish population that was being organized to undertake the migration to Palestine. In the literature relative to the immigration, there is the understanding that there are 5 waves in the pre-state formation. There were 5 waves of Zionist immigration to Palestine in the pre-state formation, and then including in the later part, or the 5th part, is the concept of illegal immigration that also is incorporated into the aliyah, and then the post-state aliyah, which is often still used in certain conceptualization and certain articulation, but that could be set aside relative to post-state formation, because it becomes a state policy that defines the state as the homeland of all the Jewish people around the world. Therefore, their immigration and not citizenship, but their nationality guaranteed to them by means of their professing their religious identity. So that's a post-state is to be set aside. And here we're speaking again from the early period all the way up to 1948. Now, the first period of aliyah actually takes place in the period of 1882 to 1903. So that constitutes the first aliyah, or the first ascending or arriving to Palestine, predominantly coming from areas in Eastern Europe, in Romania and Russia. And we do have corresponding history in Eastern Europe relative to the intensification of pogroms, anti-Semitism, and attacks on the Jewish population. So it's understandable relative to the immigration pattern that is taking place, and the early settlements that begins to be formed in Palestine in the mid 1870 onward, with the idea of formulating, or the idea of constituting, some type of a Zionist community. The interesting part about that first arrival of Eastern Jewish population in Palestine is that for the most part they actually lived and interacted with the local Palestinian population. There is evidence also that Palestinians actually helped some of these early arrivals in relations to getting some basic skills relative to a land that they were not familiar with, and just to operate in the general arena in there. This does not mean that the Palestinians, as soon as they understood that this is a project for their own displacement or creating a state over them, that they did not object. They actually began to object to this arrival of population that was also facilitated by some of the European counselors that were beginning to actually play a role of middleman from their own designs and their own considerations. This is the point where the French, the British, the German, and also the Americans begin to intervene to try to divvy up parts of the Ottoman territory, being seen as the sick man of Europe. And in essence, these are processes that are occurring simultaneously. Another element to be understood in here to contextualize history, so we don't only think of history as almost separate and distinct, but rather to see all of the different actors and stimuli that influence the relationship, not only of the new arriving early Zionist settlers, but also the Palestinians on the one hand, and the larger Arab and Muslim world. This period likewise begin to be part of the intensification of the opening of missionary schools, especially in the Syrian peninsula, in Lebanon, Palestine, and other places, as well as the intensification of relations existing with the regional Arab elite in fomenting or creating further tension between the Arab parts of the Muslim world and the Ottoman world. And as such, the arrival of these new settlers in Palestine have to be contextualized within this larger framing that occurs. So we are actually not thinking in a very narrow construct to what's taken place. So that was the first group that arrived. It's approximately about 35,000 Jewish immigrants that arrive, again predominantly from Romania and Russia, and settle into various areas in Palestine. The second wave in terms of arrivals into Palestine is from 1904 to 1914. This is literally the period leading up to the First World War. And similarly, the reasons or the regions where these early immigrants are coming from predominantly is from Russia, and again the main or primary reason is the intensification of hostilities that were directed at the Jewish population. And again, this is a phenomena that we see intensification in not only in Eastern Europe but also some of the Western countries that Western part of Europe experience this intensification of anti-Semitism and discrimination directed at Jews. And again, we could see some of the articulation even in Great Britain at the time. Lord Balfour, who issues the Balfour Declaration later on, he was actually a prime minister in the early part of the 20th century, and actually was had an important role to play into crafting and supporting a most restrictive immigration law for immigrants coming to Great Britain at the time, with the specific focus on actually discriminating against the Jewish arrivals into the UK. So he had actually played a role in the intensification of otherization and discrimination directed at Jews in the UK during his period. That second group of arrivals into Palestine are approximately 40,000 that constitute what is thought to be as the second Aliyah, or the ascending into Palestine or going upward relative to Jerusalem, and that all the way up to the beginning of the First World War. During the period of the First World War, there was very limited movement of immigrants and populations in relations to Palestine. Because of the war effort, it was very difficult for movement. And even though that we have the arrival of the Jewish Legion as part of the British troops, that is not to be confused with the patterns of immigration that develops in there. So that gets us into the third wave of Zionist immigration and settlement in Palestine, and that immediately comes after the conclusion of the First World War. The third period covers the 1919 to 1923. So 1919 to 1923 is that third period, motivated by the arrival of the British occupation of Palestine, also being looking forward to a very smooth or a quick transition into possible creation of a statehood under the guise of the Balfour Declaration and the British Mandate. So those who arrived with the leadership of the Zionist movement thought is going to be an immediate, and from a settler colonial perspective, I would say the logic carries that colonial powers at the time, prior to this period, created state and dispensed with the states in the same way, almost with the writing of a paper. And an illustration of this would be, I would recommend for people just to read the history of Africa and see the whole rush toward Africa in terms of the colonial period, and how the states and the crafting of borders and boundaries and who was assigned and given territories or property would be something that people should be aware of. Or here in the United States, what we call is the Louisiana Purchase, which essentially dispensed with a mass amounts of territory. An agreement with the French government is something that we understand. So from a Zionist perspective, post World War I, they were actually arguing that they should be given the right to create a state immediately, considering the Balfour Declaration, considering the admission of the discussions of the Balfour Declarations and the boundary of the state to be in the San Remo conference that is after the end of First World War I, and also the discussions that led up to the mandate of the League of Nations, the President Wilson adoption of the Balfour Declaration. So from a settler colonial worldview, the logic holds that Zionists should have been able to create the state immediately. So in this sense, those who from the Zionist camp argue that the Great Britain have dragged its feet, they have some correction. They're correct in that framing, but at the same time, that the Palestinians were actually are acting and also engaging in resisting their own dispossession and their own erasure during the period immediately after the First World War I. So the third aliyah, or the third immigration pattern, extends from 1919 to 1923. Approximately 40,000 Jewish population arrives, predominantly from Eastern Europe, motivated and supported by the British occupation forces that facilitated the arrival of the Jewish population. And by that time, or by the end of this period, we're talking about close to 90,000 population in Palestine. And again, the discussions or the direction that is shifting and moving is toward creation of a state that will displace the Palestinians. So this is the high point, or the beginning of the high point of the tension that develops between the Palestinians on the one hand and the newly arrival of Zionism. So again, this is to step back and dispense with the notions that the Palestinians oppose Zionism because it was directed, or because it had its Jewish identity. And I think what we need is to de-aggregate this. The Palestinians opposed Zionism because Zionism wanted to displace them, wanted to expel them, wanted to take over their land, and wanted to create a state that is beholden to Zionism, while at the point of arrival, 97% of the land is inhabited by indigenous Palestinians that also had a segment of the Jewish population that had lived with the Palestinians and is Palestinian in terms of its background, because a Palestinian is a person that could be a Muslim, a Jewish, or a Christian. So those historical communities that lived in Palestine, whether it's in the area of Tabariyas in the north, or in the area of Nablus, in the city of Nablus, or in, around the city of Al-Khalil, or also in some other communities throughout Palestine. These are the historical communities that have lived and are part and parcel of Palestine. that tension develops as a result of the arrival of a settler colonial community that is seeking, from its pronouncement and its policy, to actually dispense and transfer the Palestinians out. Important also that by the third Aliyah, what we begin to see is that these Zionist communities are beginning to constitute themselves as an exclusive community, not allowing or engaging in any type of cooperative economic relations. They were beginning to restrict the use of Arab labor, the restriction of engagement in the Arab market. So what we are beginning to get is an exclusivity structure that is developing relative to the third Aliyah and the development of these settler communities that begin to have exclusive dominion, as well as the beginning of the armaments, that these becomes armed outposts, in a sense seeing themselves as a distinct and as a community that is intent is to create a separate state without including or accepting the presence of the Palestinians. In essence, the concept of transfer that was foundational to Zionism, as well as the concept of having to actually redeem the land. In essence, for the modern Zionists to emerge into the present period or into modernity, there has to be a matrimony, a bond that is to be constituted between the person, the Zionist person, and the land. So the concept of redeeming Palestine's land becomes a foundational, because the birth into modernity of a Zionist person by necessity requires a control and domination of land, and removing anything that might defile or might be seen as inhibiting the possibility of this new birth into modernity. So to be born into a modern nation state with a powerful person into the modern discourse, that relationship with the land has to be founded. And also what you see also in Zionist discourse in this period is also a dispensing of the classical attachment to the book. So it's no longer by the book, meaning the religious text, that Zion is born, is by means of actually force and power. So the introduction of violence as an ingredient and as a condition to bring forth the creation of this modern state, and therefore is the powerful person wedded into and dominating and redeeming the land from the Palestinians is the foundational element that pushes this Zionist movement forward. So that's the beginning of the third Aliyah, or the third wave of Zionist immigration to Palestine. The fourth wave takes place between 1924 and 1929, and that is the wave that comes to, actually the fourth wave is 1924 to 1929, and the large number of population that arrives to Palestine during this time is about 82,000 population that arrive from Poland, Hungary, and other areas in Eastern Europe. So we could see in here that the immigration to Palestine by segments of the Jewish populations predominantly in Eastern Europe, and therefore one has to raise the question about the distinctive forms of anti-Semitism, otherization, discrimination, and total commitment to elimination of the Jewish person in Eastern Europe is something to have to be spoken of relative to this flow of immigration. Another part that has to be added to there is that also the United States had an Immigration Act of 1924 that likewise restricted immigration from parts of the world, including parts of Eastern Europe, and thus reduced the quota, or reduced the numbers of immigrants to be allowed in the United States, something that might be comparable to what we're experiencing today. I think in here one can ask the question, could it been that Jewish populations that were immigrated could have reached a relationship with the Palestinians, or the various parts of the Arab and Muslim world if it was not couched or it was not part of a settler colonial project. And I think that is the question that that possibly could be contemplated. The basis of the tension is not the Jewish identity. The basis of the tension is a settler colonial program that says, for me to exist, I need to eliminate you. For me to exist, I need to transfer you out. For me to exist, I need to redeem the land using the type of religious texts. And as such, my existence, i.e. for the Zionist perspective, my creation of a national homeland in partnership with Great Britain passes through the necessity of expulsion and removal of the Palestinians. Now that becomes a very important aspect in order to contemplate what are the alternative possibilities. And again, those possibilities, if the Jews were escaping a very real persecution that is endemic, which I tend to say that it is normative in Europe, that this persecution have taken place. And as such, I think projecting the same type of persecution, the same type of intense anti-Semitism and violence committed against the Jewish person in Europe on the Arab and Muslim world is another dimensionality of the error that is committed by Zionist thinkers relative to how they conceive themselves in the Arab and Muslim world or in Palestine. They conceive themselves to be a Western community as an outpost of civilization, which they internalize European framing of otherization, European racial framing, and civilizational mission in order to have a foothold on Palestine. In this sense, again, the tension develops as a result of the ideology that emerges out of Zionism rather than the particular notion or the particular aspect of the Jewish identity in relations in this relation. So I think it would be very important to conceptualize and to contemplate what would be those possibilities as well, and to constantly critique what brought this tension and this confrontation to fore. And my argument, again, what brought it to fore is the settler colonial project in partnership with the premier settler colonial state and general colonialism, which is Great Britain, that was the preeminent colonial power at the time, and also facilitated a divide and conquer, not only among colonized population, but also instrumentalizing certain colonized population, as well as favoring some segments in this. So again, the British had a role in fomenting or transferring the tension out of a European context into Palestine. So the fifth period of Aliyah is from 1929 to 1939. And this period of immigration to Palestine comes as a direct result of the rise of Nazi Germany and Nazism as a movement, and its targeting of the Jewish person and the Jewish communities in various parts of Germany and then later on in Europe. That movement resulted in Jews who were trying to escape and find ways out of Germany and out of possible impending catastrophe that will be coming, and the impending pogroms that will be carried out in mass, which leads up to the Nazi Holocaust that is committed against the Jewish population throughout Europe. Now, during this fifth Aliyah period, we get about 250,000 that arrive in Palestine, with the bulk of them coming between 1933 and 1936, 174,000. So that also gets us to explain why in 1936 the Palestinians begin to mobilize a general strike, a total strike against the British, as well as against the Zionist, the intensification of Zionist settlements and immigration. It leads to the displacement of large segment of the fallahin, of the peasants, a transformation of the economy that takes place, and also explains the British issuing the white paper from their own vantage point, again, as a way to try to deal with the rising protests among the Palestinians, also preparation for the war effort, the British wanted to seek some type of accommodation and some type of favor with the Arab populations in various parts of the Arab world, so they could help and participate in the war effort. So they actually limited or issued the white paper in order to limit immigration for a 5-year period, with each year having about 15,000 to a total of 75,000 population. Now, the white paper was opposed by the Zionist movement, but at the same time, it's an opposition that also have some favor into it. So it's a mixed bag in relations. They oppose the immigration, but they also looked favorably relative to certain aspects that might have been included early on relative to delineation of population. So it's still committed about 75,000 to be admitted to Palestine. And by 1940, the Jewish population in Palestine reaches to about 450,000 in there. And then a larger group also arrives immediately after the period of the war. There were a considerable part of illegal immigration. So you have the official records of legal immigrations to Palestine that was accounted for. And then there is a whole period or whole numbers of illegal immigrants as well that arrive to Palestine. So this is how Palestine, from a very small community that's counting to a few thousand, maybe 25,000 prior to the 20th century, maybe 35,000 plus, to a almost becoming 33% of the population by the time we get into the end of the Second World War and arriving into the 1948. The bulk of Zionist immigration to Palestine occurs again from, if you take it from the 3rd to the 5th period, from the 3rd to the 5th wave, and then the larger segment thereafter comes after the constituting of the state. But we will deal with the post-state immigration and the population to be brought to Palestine at a later point. But up to 1948 period, it is these patterns of waves of immigration. One has to be accurate to say that definitely and for sure anti-Semitism and discrimination and violence and racism toward Jews in Europe had a considerable role to play in terms of the immigration out of Europe into Palestine. But also one has to say that other countries have limited immigration into their own territory, including the United States, thus forcing and making it possible actually for Jewish immigration to be only or having the only option to Palestine in order to fulfill the creation or the fulfillment of the Zionist project in Palestine. So in order to nuance the processes by which Palestine became or arrived at this conflict that exists on the one hand between the Palestinians and the Zionist movement. So there are many actors and forces that coalesce to bring about this intensification. An example would be during the World War I. If we think about the migration to Palestine, actually very limited amount, from almost 2 million Jewish population that shifted around, only 40,000 opted to come to Palestine, where the most actually migrated out to Western Europe and the United States. So if the Jewish populations were given the real options in terms of immigration, the primary direction of immigration would have been Western Europe and the United States. In a similar way, post Russia's collapse, that the primary option or choice of people to immigrate is to immigrate to the United States or parts of Western Europe, and as such Israel worked to facilitate the immigration of a large segment of Russian Jews into Palestine, and those who migrated to Palestine also saw it that's an easy access to the United States. So this is again to contextualize history and the movement of people. We're not speaking about the individual as an individual, but speaking about the structures that makes it possible for essentially to create a displacement and dispossession of a wholesale population as well as the Palestinians, and then creating a state on top of them that leads to the Nakba in 1948 and continue to feel and see the effects of it up to the present day. So this is today, again, we covered the Zionist immigration and settlements in Palestine, the period, the 5 waves, the illegal immigration, and then hopefully as we move forward we'll continue to expand and deal with one issue at a time in order for us to have a complete sense of the modern history of Palestine and its interactions or its intersection with settler colonialism, in order to have a lens to examine Palestine through a de-colonial lens. So thank you for being with me today on Palestine De-Colonial series, and hopefully we'll see you again in the future. Assalamu alaikum.